The spring of 1945 arrived in northern Germany like an uninvited guest, cold and apologetic. Snow still clung to the ditches where the roads had been, and the sky hung low and grey, as if ashamed to witness what the war had left behind. The Third Reich, once a machine of terrifying precision, now lay scattered across the mud in broken pieces. Cities that had thundered with rallies were silent, except for the wind through hollow windows. Factories stood gutted, rails twisted like dead vines, and in the chaos of collapse, millions moved without direction, refugees, surrendered soldiers, and those caught between armies with nowhere left to run. Among them were the women, thousands of young women who had served the Wehrmacht, not as soldiers, but as the invisible infrastructure of war. Signallers, clerks, nurses, switchboard operators, they had believed the work would keep them safe, far from the fighting. But safety was an illusion that crumbled with every Allied advance. Now, as May approached, these women found themselves adrift in a landscape that no longer recognized them. The Reich had abandoned them. Their families were scattered or dead, and the victors, moving fast through the wreckage, had little time to distinguish between perpetrators and the merely complicit. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Elsa Richter was 23 years old, though hunger had aged her face beyond counting. Before the war, she had worked in a bakery in Lübeck, her hands white with flour, her apron dusted with sugar. She remembered the warmth of the ovens, the smell of rising dough, the way her mother would hum while kneading bread. That world felt impossibly distant now, as if it belonged to someone else's memory. She had joined the Nachrichtenhelferinnen, the Women's Signal Auxiliary, in 1943 when the call came for volunteers. It promised meaningful work, she had told herself, and escape from the relentless bombing of the coast. For 2 years, she operated telephone exchanges, relaying orders she barely understood, connecting voices that grew more desperate with each passing month. By April 1945, her unit was stationed near Lüneburg, a town the British were approaching fast. The officers vanished first, slipping away in the night without orders or farewells. Then the soldiers, those too exhausted to fight, simply walked off into the forest. Elsa and the other women, 18 of them in total, waited in a requisitioned schoolhouse, uncertain what else to do. They had no weapons, no transport, and no idea if surrender was even an option. For 3 days, they survived on a sack of dried peas and water from a well that tasted of rust. On the 4th morning, British tanks rolled into the village, their tracks grinding over cobblestones with a sound like distant thunder. The women stood in the schoolyard, hands raised, shaking from cold and fear. Elsa's knees felt weak, her vision narrowing at the edges. She hadn't eaten properly in a week. The British soldiers dismounted with rifles slung, their faces hard but not cruel, exhausted men in khaki doing a job they no longer had energy to hate. A sergeant with a weathered face and a clipped accent gestured for them to line up. One by one, they were searched, their pockets emptied, their identification papers examined. Elsa's hands trembled as she handed over her sold book, the military paybook that marked her as auxiliary personnel. The sergeant glanced at it, said something in English she couldn't understand, then waved her toward a waiting truck. They were driven north, the truck jolting over roads cratered by artillery. Through gaps in the canvas, Elsa glimpsed the wreckage of Germany. Farmhouses with walls blown out, orchards stripped bare by desperate civilians. Columns of refugees trudging westward, their faces blank with exhaustion. The British soldiers riding with them said nothing, smoking in silence, their eyes distant. After what felt like hours, the truck stopped at a muddy field surrounded by barbed wire. A makeshift holding pen, little more than open ground with a few sagging tents. Guards stood at intervals, rifles loose in their hands, watching with the weary indifference of men who had seen too much. The women were herded inside. No one explained what would happen next. There was no food, no water, no instructions. Just the wire, the mud, and the silence of abandonment. Elsa sank to the ground beside a thin, blonde girl named Frieda, a radio operator from Hamburg, who had not spoken since they were captured. Around them, other women huddled in small groups, whispering in low, frightened voices. Some had been there for days already, their faces hollow, their uniforms streaked with filth. One woman lay motionless in the corner of a tent, too weak to sit upright. No one knew if she was sleeping or dying. Night came quickly, and with it a cold that bit through their thin coats. Elsa pressed close to Frida for warmth, her stomach cramping with hunger. She thought of the bread her mother used to bake, the crust cracking under her fingers, the soft white centre still warm. The memory was so vivid it hurt. She wondered if her mother was still alive, if the bakery still stood, if any part of her old life remained. But thinking of home made the present unbearable, so she forced herself to focus on smaller things. The sound of rain beginning to fall, the distant rumble of trucks, the way her breath fogged in the cold air. The British guards changed shifts at dawn. Elsa watched them through the wire, trying to read their faces. Some looked young, barely older than herself. Others were hardened veterans, their expressions unreadable. They spoke little, mostly to each other, their words clipped and foreign. Once, a guard passed close to the wire, and Elsa caught his eye. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, two strangers on opposite sides of a war neither had started. Then he turned away, lighting a cigarette, and the moment passed. Days blurred together. The women received no rations, no blankets, nothing but indifference. A few tried to beg through the wire, calling out in broken English. But the guards either ignored them or waved them back. Elsa's hunger deepened, moving beyond pain into a kind of hollow numbness. Her body felt light, insubstantial, as if she might simply fade into the mud. Frida stopped moving entirely by the third day, lying curled on her side, eyes open but unseeing. Elsa shook her gently, whispered her name, but received no response. It was then that reality settled over her like a shroud. They had not been captured to be imprisoned. They had been captured to be forgotten. The war was ending, yes, but its aftermath held no place for women like them. They were inconvenient remnants, too German to be trusted, too lowly to matter. The Allies were stretched thin, managing millions of prisoners, displaced persons, and a continent in ruins. What were 18 auxiliary women against that chaos? Nothing. Less than nothing. On the morning of the 6th day, Elsa woke to find 2 of the women had died in the night. Their bodies lay still beneath the torn canvas of the tent, faces grey, mouths slightly open. No one screamed. No one wept. There was no energy left for grief. The women simply moved away, giving the dead space, as if death were contagious. Elsa stared at them, her mind struggling to process what her eyes saw. These were living people yesterday. Now they were objects, soon to be dragged away and buried without ceremony. She felt something crack inside her then, not dramatically, but quietly, like ice splitting under weight. This was how it ended, not with violence or vengeance, but with neglect. They would die here in the mud, and no one would remember their names. The thought should have terrified her, but, instead, it brought a strange, cold clarity. If death was inevitable, then fear was pointless. She sat up slowly, her body protesting every movement, and looked toward the wire. A British guard stood there, younger than most, with a thin face and dark circles under his eyes. He was staring at the bodies, his expression frozen between shock and something else, something that looked almost like shame. Elsa watched him, wondering if he saw them as people or just as problems. Then, as if feeling her gaze, he turned. Their eyes met across the wire, and for a long, suspended moment, neither looked away. His name was Corporal Thomas Henley, though Elsa wouldn't learn that until later. He was 25 years old, a schoolteacher from Kent who had joined up in 1939 believing in duty and decency. He had fought through France and the Low Countries, seen friends die in hedgerows and villages whose names he could no longer remember. He thought he had become numb to suffering, but standing there, looking at the starving women and the 2 dead bodies no one had bothered to remove, something in him refused to harden further. He turned abruptly and walked toward the command tent, his boots squelching in the mud. The officer in charge, a tired lieutenant named Graham, barely looked up from his paperwork. Henley cleared his throat. "Sir, those women haven't been fed." Graham sighed, rubbing his eyes. "We're waiting on supplies, Corporal. You know how it is." "They're prisoners," Henley said, his voice tight. "Not livestock. 2 of them died last night." Graham's pen stopped moving. He looked up, something flickering in his expression. Exhaustion, guilt, the weight of too many impossible decisions. "Christ," he muttered. "All right, see what you can scrounge, but don't promise anything. We're barely keeping our own men fed." Henley saluted and left before the order could be rescinded. He walked to the mess tent, found the cook, a gruff Welshman named Davies, and explained the situation. Davies listened, frowning, then shook his head. "Regulations say prisoners get rations, but we've got nothing to spare." Henley leaned closer, his voice dropping. 2 women died last night, Davies. We can't just let them starve." Davies studied him for a long moment, then sighed and turned to a stack of crates. He pulled out a tin of biscuits, a jar of tinned meat, and a canteen of water. "This is from my own kit," he said quietly. "Don't tell anyone." Henley took the supplies, feeling their weight in his hands, knowing it was nowhere near enough but understanding it was something. He walked back to the wire, heart pounding with a strange mixture of anger and resolve. The women watched him approach, their eyes wary, too beaten down to hope. Henley knelt by the wire and pushed the tin of biscuits through the gap at the bottom. Elsa stared at it, uncomprehending. Then, slowly, she crawled forward, her hands shaking as she reached for it. Her fingers closed around the tin, and she looked up at him, her eyes wide and wet. "Danke," she whispered, the word broken. Henley nodded once, then passed through the canteen and the tinned meat. The women surged forward, not violently but desperately, their hands reaching, their voices rising in a murmur of disbelief. Henley stepped back, watching as they divided the meagre supplies with surprising care, each taking only a small portion to ensure everyone received something. Elsa took a single biscuit, held it to her lips, and bit down. The taste, dry and plain, was overwhelming. She closed her eyes, tears spilling down her cheeks. Henley stood there, knowing he had just crossed a line that regulations and orders would not forgive easily. But as he watched the starving women eat, as he saw the faint return of light to their eyes, he felt something he hadn't felt in months, a sense that the war hadn't taken everything, that beneath the machinery of violence and bureaucracy, humanity could still flicker. Behind him, another guard approached, a sergeant named Bartlett, older and harder. "What are you doing, Corporal?" Henley turned, his jaw set. What someone should have done days ago. Bartlett's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, Lieutenant Graham appeared, drawn by the commotion. He looked at the women, at the empty tin, at Henley standing defiant by the wire. For a moment, silence held, heavy and uncertain. Then Graham spoke, his voice low. "Get them proper rations, Corporal, and see to those bodies. We're not savages." Henley saluted, relief flooding through him. As he turned back to the wire, he saw Elsa watching him, her face still gaunt but no longer empty. Their eyes met again, and something unspoken passed between them, not gratitude alone, but recognition. The acknowledgement that even in the ruins of war, a single choice could matter. The rain began to fall again, soft and steady, washing the mud into dark rivulets. Elsa clutched the biscuit tin to her chest, feeling the warmth of the corporal's defiance settle over her like a fragile shield. She didn't know what would come next, whether this small mercy would hold or collapse under the weight of orders and scarcity. But for the first time in days, she felt the faintest ember of something she had thought lost forever. Hope. The rations arrived that afternoon, carried in wooden crates by 2 privates who looked confused by the urgency. Thin soup, hardtack biscuits, tins of corned beef, nothing lavish, but to the starving women it was abundance. Corporal Thomas Henley supervised the distribution himself, ensuring each woman received an equal portion. He watched as they ate slowly, deliberately, their bodies too starved to handle sudden plenty. One girl vomited immediately, her stomach rejecting the richness. Another wept silently, clutching her tin as if it might vanish. Elsa ate with careful discipline, forcing herself to take small bites, to let each mouthful settle before taking another. The soup scalded her throat, but the warmth spreading through her chest felt like life returning. Across from her, Frida stirred for the first time in days, lifting her head to accept the cup someone pressed into her hands. Her eyes, vacant for so long, focused briefly on the liquid, then on Elsa. A ghost of recognition passed between them. Henley remained by the wire long after the food was distributed, watching not with the detachment of a guard, but with the careful attention of someone who had just taken responsibility. He noted which women struggled to swallow, which needed medical attention, which had the strength to help others. His mind was already working through logistics he had no authority to implement. They needed blankets, proper shelter, and a medical officer to examine them. 2 had already died. How many more would follow if conditions didn't improve? Lieutenant Graham appeared beside him as the sun began its descent, painting the muddy field in shades of amber and shadow. The dead women had been removed, their bodies wrapped in canvas and taken away. Graham stood with his hands clasped behind his back, staring at the scene. "This isn't official policy, Corporal," he said quietly. "You understand that?" Henley kept his eyes forward. "Yes, sir, but it's the right thing." Graham was silent for a moment, then nodded slowly. "The right thing," he repeated, as if testing the weight of the words. The phrase seems almost quaint now, doesn't it, after everything we've seen? Henley turned to look at his commanding officer. Graham was in his mid-30s, a solicitor before the war, with the weary eyes of a man who had spent too long making impossible choices. "Sir, permission to speak freely?" Graham smiled faintly. "When have you ever asked permission, Henley?" "These women aren't combatants," Henley said. "They're auxiliaries, clerks, telephone operators. Most of them probably never saw a battlefield, and we're letting them die of neglect because we're too overwhelmed to care." Graham's expression hardened, not with anger, but with the pain of truth acknowledged. "You think I don't know that? You think I sleep well knowing what's happening in camps like this across Germany? We've got millions of prisoners, Corporal. Millions. The logistics alone are impossible. Food, shelter, medical care, it's all stretched beyond breaking. Someone has to wait. Someone always has to wait." "Then let it not be them," Henley said. "Not any more." For a long moment Graham studied him, seeing perhaps an echo of his own younger self, the man who had believed law and order could hold even in war's aftermath. Finally, he sighed. "I'll requisition proper supplies. Medical officer, blankets, better rations. But it'll take time, and I can't promise anything beyond this camp. There are hundreds more like it. Hundreds." Henley nodded. "I understand, sir. One camp at a time." As Graham walked away, Sergeant Bartlett approached, his weathered face unreadable. "You've got a soft heart, Corporal," he said, not unkindly. "It'll get you in trouble." "It already has," Henley replied. Bartlett chuckled dryly, pulling out a cigarette and lighting it with practiced ease. The smoke curled upward in the still air. "You know what the problem is with soft hearts? They break. These women," he gestured toward the wire, "they're German. Their boys killed plenty of ours. Some might say let them starve." Henley's jaw tightened. "Some might say a lot of things, Sergeant. Doesn't make them right." "War's over. If we don't start acting like it, what did we even fight for?" Bartlett took a long drag, exhaling slowly. "Spoken like a schoolteacher," he said, but there was no mockery in his tone. "Just be careful, lad. Mercy's a slippery thing in places like this. Sometimes it costs more than you expect." That night, Henley couldn't sleep. He lay on his cot in the guard's tent, staring at the canvas ceiling, listening to the rain drum steadily outside. His mind kept returning to Elsa's face when she had bitten into that first biscuit, the Binzebe, tears running down her hollow cheeks, the way her hands had trembled. He thought of his sister Margaret, back home in Kent, probably worrying herself sick over him. Margaret was a nurse, had seen her own share of suffering during the Blitz. What would she think of him now, standing guard over starving women while bureaucracy moved at a crawl? He rose quietly and pulled on his coat, stepping out into the wet darkness. The camp was silent except for the hiss of rain and the occasional cough from the women's section. He walked to the wire, keeping his distance, not wanting to disturb them. But as his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he saw a figure sitting upright near the fence. Elsa. She was awake, staring out at nothing, her blanket pulled tight around her shoulders. She sensed his presence and turned. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the wire and the darkness. Then Henley spoke softly in halting German, words he had picked up over months of occupation. "Gut, are you well?" Elsa's lips curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Besser," she replied. "Better." She paused, searching for English words. "Thank you." The gratitude in her voice carried more weight than the simple phrase could hold. Henley stepped closer to the wire. "What's your name?" "Elsa," she said. "Elsa Richter. From Lübeck." "Thomas Henley," he replied. "Kent." They stood in silence, the rain falling between them, two people from different worlds connected by the strange gravity of war's aftermath. "Why?" Elsa asked finally, her English fragile but clear enough. "Why help?" Henley considered the question. "Because it's right," he said simply. "Because you're human beings. Because the war is over and someone has to remember what that means." Elsa absorbed this, her eyes glistening in the dim light. "In Germany," she said slowly, "they tell us British are cold, no heart." She gestured toward him, then toward the camp. "Not cold." He almost laughed, a short, bitter sound. "We're not saints, Elsa. We've done our share of terrible things. But maybe, just maybe, we can try to do better now, when it matters. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this." The medical officer arrived 2 days later, a gruff Scot named Captain Morrison who examined each woman with efficient thoroughness. He diagnosed malnutrition, dehydration, several cases of pneumonia, and one severe infection that required immediate antibiotics. Morrison was not a sentimental man, but even he seemed shaken by the conditions. "This is barbaric," he told Graham bluntly. "These women should have been triaged days ago. War's chaos, Lieutenant, I understand that. But this is on us." Graham accepted the rebuke in silence, knowing it was deserved. Additional supplies began arriving, slowly but steadily. Blankets, proper tents with wooden floors, more substantial rations. The transformation was not miraculous. Recovery from starvation takes weeks, but it was tangible. The women began to move more, to speak in voices that carried hope rather than despair. Frida sat up for the first time in a week, her blonde hair matted but her eyes clear. Another woman, a former nurse named Margarete, began helping Morrison with the sicker patients. Her medical training remembered despite exhaustion. Elsa recovered faster than most, her youth and previous health serving her well. Within a week, she was strong enough to walk unassisted, to help distribute rations, to translate between the British guards and the German women. She became a bridge, trusted by both sides, her presence easing tensions that might otherwise have festered. Henley found himself seeking her out during his rounds, ostensibly to coordinate logistics, but truthfully because her company reminded him of something he had nearly forgotten. Normalcy, conversation that wasn't about death or orders or the machinery of war. They talked in fragments, his broken German mixing with her improving English, creating a pidgin language that belonged to neither but served both. She told him about the bakery, about her mother's bread, about how she had joined the auxiliaries thinking it would be an adventure. He told her about teaching history to boys who would rather play cricket, about the strange irony of fighting a war to preserve a world he wasn't sure existed anymore. Their conversations were careful, circling around the heavier truths, the guilt and grief that neither was ready to articulate. One afternoon, as Henley supervised a work detail repairing the tents, Elsa approached with a question. The other women, she said hesitantly, wanted to know, "What happens to us? Where do we go?" Henley paused, hammer in hand. "Truthfully, I don't know yet," he admitted. "There are processing centres being set up. You'll be interviewed, checked against war crimes lists, then likely released to return home, if you have homes to return to." Elsa nodded slowly, absorbing this. "And if there is no home?" Henley set down the hammer, meeting her eyes. "Then they'll help you find one. Displaced persons camps, resettlement programs. It won't be easy, Elsa. Germany's in ruins, but you'll survive. You've survived this much already." She looked around the camp, at the women who were slowly coming back to life, at the wire that still enclosed them but no longer felt like a tomb. "Because of you," she said quietly. "You made them see." Henley shook his head. "I gave them biscuits and yelled at my lieutenant." "That's hardly heroic." "It was enough," Elsa insisted. Her voice carried a conviction that unsettled him. "Sometimes, enough is everything." The weeks that followed brought a strange routine to the camp. The women were put to work on light tasks, sorting supplies, mending uniforms, helping with administrative paperwork. It gave them purpose and dignity, something beyond mere survival. The British Guards, initially wary, began to relax. Conversations developed, cautious but genuine. One young private from Manchester taught Margaretti English phrases. A Welsh corporal traded cigarettes for a song, a haunting German melody that drifted through the evening air and left men staring into their tea with faraway eyes. But not everything softened. One night, a group of newly arrived soldiers, fresh from the horrors of liberating Bergen-Belsen, saw the German women being treated with relative kindness and exploded in rage. They confronted Henley and Graham, demanding to know why enemy women received care while British prisoners had starved in Nazi camps. The argument was fierce, the anger justified and raw. Henley stood his ground, but the encounter left him shaken. The moral landscape of post-war Europe was treacherous, every act of mercy weighed against remembered atrocities, every kindness suspect. Graham pulled him aside afterward, his face drawn. "They're not wrong, you know," the lieutenant said quietly. "Our boys suffered horribly in German hands, and here we are feeding their women. The optics are complicated." "The optics are irrelevant," Henley replied, but his voice lacked its usual certainty. "These women didn't run concentration camps, sir. They operated telephones. Punishing them for crimes they didn't commit, that's not justice. It's just more cruelty." Graham nodded slowly. "I agree. But justice and revenge look very similar when you're standing in the ruins. Remember that, Corporal. Not everyone will see what you're doing as right. Some will see it as betrayal." Henley understood then that his small act of defiance existed in a vast, contested space, where competing moralities collided and no answer satisfied everyone. He could only hold to what his conscience demanded and hope it was enough. As spring deepened into early summer, word came that the camp would be closed. The women would be transferred to a larger processing facility near Hamburg, where official decisions about their futures would be made. The news brought mixed emotions. Relief that the limbo was ending, fear of what came next. Elsa received it with characteristic composure, but Henley saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands clenched briefly before relaxing. On the last evening before the transfer, Henley walked the perimeter one final time. The camp was quiet, the women packing their few belongings, saying goodbyes to guards who had become familiar faces. He found Elsa sitting alone near the wire, staring at the horizon where the sun was setting in shades of gold and red. He approached slowly, and she turned, offering a small smile. "Tomorrow we leave," she said. "Yes," Henley replied, sitting on a crate nearby. "How do you feel?" "Scared," she admitted. "But also grateful. For this place, for you." She paused, choosing words carefully. "You gave me something I thought the war had taken. Hope. That sounds How do you say, sentimental? Henley shook his head. It sounds human. That's all any of us can be now. Elsa was quiet for a moment, then asked, What will you do? After? Go home, Henley said. Try to be a teacher again. Try to forget. But forgetting proved impossible. The weeks turned to months, and Henley found himself changed in ways he couldn't articulate to those who hadn't been there. He remained in Germany through the summer of 1945, as the occupation solidified and the machinery of reconstruction began its slow, grinding work. The camp near Lüneburg was long closed, but others remained, and Henley was transferred to a larger facility outside Hamburg, where thousands of German prisoners awaited processing. The work was monotonous, endless paperwork, interrogations, the sorting of human lives into categories, war criminal, Nazi party member, innocent civilian, enemy combatant. The distinctions that had seemed so clear in wartime blurred in the aftermath. Henley interviewed former soldiers who wept for their dead children. He processed party members who had joined only to keep their jobs. He saw old men who had believed every lie and young boys who had believed nothing but fought anyway because refusal meant death. And he saw women, hundreds of them, thousands across the British zone, auxiliary personnel, nurses, factory workers, secretaries who had typed orders for the Wehrmacht. Some were defiant, still clinging to the shattered ideology. Others were broken, hollowed out by hunger and shame. Most were simply exhausted, wanting only to go home, if home still existed. Henley treated them all with the same measured courtesy, remembering Elsa's face, remembering that behind every uniform was a person whose story he would never fully know. One afternoon in late July, a woman arrived at his processing station, thin and pale, with dark circles under her eyes. She handed over her papers, and Henley scanned them mechanically. Signals auxiliary, stationed near Kassel, no party affiliation, standard case. As he stamped her release papers, she spoke in halting English. You are the one, yes? From Lüneburg camp? Henley looked up, startled. She continued, My friend was there, Elsa Richter. She told me, if I see a British corporal named Henley, to say thank you. She is alive, in Lübeck with her mother. The words hit Henley with unexpected force. He hadn't realized how much he'd needed to know, that his small intervention had lasted, that Elsa had survived the processing centres and found her way home. He cleared his throat, keeping his voice steady. Tell her, if you see her again, that I'm glad. The woman nodded, took her papers, and left. Henley sat for a long moment, staring at nothing, feeling something loosen in his chest. But not all news was good. In August, Henley learned that Frieda, the blonde radio operator who had lain nearly comatose in the mud, had died 3 weeks after leaving the Lüneburg camp, pneumonia, compounded by malnutrition. The medical care had come too late for her weakened body. The news arrived in a routine report, a single line, among hundreds, but it gutted Henley. He had thought he'd saved them all. The illusion of his own efficacy shattered against the reality that mercy, no matter how genuine, couldn't undo weeks of neglect. He found himself drinking more in the officers' mess, sitting alone with a glass of whiskey, turning over the mathematics of survival. 17 saved, 1 lost. Was that victory or failure? Lieutenant Graham, now promoted to captain, found him one evening and sat down without invitation. You can't save everyone, Henley, he said quietly. I've learned that the hard way. You do what you can, when you can, and you live with the rest. Does it get easier? Henley asked. Living with it? Graham considered, swirling his own drink. No, but you learn to carry it differently. The weight doesn't change, but you get stronger. He paused, then added, What you did at Lüneburg, that mattered. Don't let one death erase 17 lives. Henley wanted to believe him, but the guilt sat heavy anyway, a companion he would carry long after he left Germany. In September, Henley received a letter. It had been forwarded through multiple channels, arriving battered and smudged, the handwriting careful and unfamiliar. He opened it in his tent, hands suddenly unsteady. Dear Corporal Henley, Forgive my English. It is not good, but I will try. I hope this letter finds you. I want you to know I am home in Lübeck with my mother. Our house is damaged, but we will repair it. Slowly, everything repairs slowly. I think of the camp often. I think of how close I came to not being here. You gave me more than food. You gave me the belief that not all of the world had become cruel. In the darkest time, that belief was enough to keep living for. My mother asks me to thank you also. She says a mother's gratitude is deeper than words. She lights a candle for you in our church, though we do not know if you are religious. It is the only way she knows to honor what you did. I do not know what your life is like now, or if you think of those days. But I want you to know that your kindness did not end when the trucks took us away. It lives in me, in how I try to treat others, in how I will teach my children someday, if I am blessed with children. You showed me that one person can choose to be human when the world chooses to be hard. I will not forget. I hope you go home soon. I hope you find peace. With deepest gratitude, Elsa Richter Henley read the letter 3 times, then carefully folded it and placed it in his breast pocket, next to a photograph of his sister. He carried it there for the remainder of his service, a talisman against the darkness that sometimes threatened to overwhelm him. On the worst days, when the processing felt endless and the stories too heavy, he would touch the pocket and remember that something good had emerged from the chaos. He was finally demobilized in November 1945, sailing from Hamburg on a grey morning that smelled of salt and diesel. As the German coast receded, Henley stood at the rail, watching Europe disappear into mist. He thought of all the camps, all the faces, all the decisions made in exhaustion and moral fog. He thought of the men he'd lost, the friends buried in French soil. And he thought of Elsa, alive in a ruined city, rebuilding with her mother, carrying forward a kindness that had cost him almost nothing but had meant everything. England welcomed him home with bunting and brass bands, with speeches about victory and sacrifice. But Henley found himself unable to join the celebrations. He attended a few receptions, shook hands with local officials, accepted their thanks with polite distance. The war they celebrated felt different from the one he'd experienced. They spoke of triumph and righteousness. He remembered mud and hunger and the terrible complexity of trying to be decent in indecent times. His sister Margaret understood, in the way only those who'd seen their own horrors could. She'd nursed men dying of burns during the Blitz, had held their hands as they called for mothers who would never come. Over tea in her kitchen, Henley finally told her about Lüneburg, about the starving women and the choice he'd made. Margaret listened without interruption, then reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "You did right, Tommy," she said simply. "Whatever else haunts you, let that be the thing you hold on to." Returning to teaching proved harder than he'd anticipated. The boys seemed impossibly young, their concerns trivial after what he'd witnessed. How could he care about missed homework when he'd seen people die of starvation? How could he lecture about historical dates when history felt like an open wound? But gradually, the rhythm of the classroom worked its own healing. The questions the students asked, innocent and curious, reminded him of what he'd been fighting for. A world where children could be children, where the future wasn't predetermined by ideology and violence. He met Catherine in 1947, a librarian with kind eyes and a sharp wit who never pressed him about the war but listened when he needed to speak. They married the following spring in a quiet ceremony that felt like a new beginning. When their first child was born in 1949, a daughter they named Elizabeth, Henley held her with a tenderness that surprised him. This, he thought, was what survival meant, not just enduring, but building something new from the ruins. But the past never fully released him. In 1952, a documentary about the occupation of Germany aired on the BBC. Henley watched it with Catherine, seeing familiar landscapes, hearing familiar stories. When a segment showed a displaced person's camp, Catherine noticed his hands clenching. "Were you there?" she asked softly. "Somewhere like it," he replied. That night he told her everything he'd told no one except Margaret, about Elsa, about the women who'd died, about the weight of small mercies in a merciless time. Catherine listened, then said something that stayed with him forever. You can't carry their survival as your burden, Thomas. You gave them a chance. What they did with it, that's their strength, not just yours. The words didn't erase the guilt over Frida's death or the others he couldn't help, but they shifted something, allowing him to see his actions not as failures measured against an impossible standard, but as human attempts at decency in indecent circumstances. In 1963, Henley received another letter, this one from West Germany, forwarded through the British Legion. The handwriting was the same, though older, more confident. Dear Thomas, I hope I may call you Thomas. Corporal feels too formal for old friends. I write to tell you I am married now, to a good man named Klaus who was also in the war. We have 2 children, Anna and Wilhelm. We live in a new apartment in Lübeck, not far from where the old bakery stood. My mother passed away last year, peacefully. Her last words were about you, the English soldier who saved her daughter. I told my children about you recently. Anna, who is 8, asked if you were a hero. I said you were something better, a man who chose kindness when it would have been easier to do nothing. Klaus wants to thank you also. He said the world needed more moments like yours, especially now, when the wall divides our country and old hatreds threaten to return. If you ever come to Germany, please visit us. You would be welcomed as family. That is what you are to me, the family that chooses to save you when the world would let you perish. I pray you have found peace. I pray your family brings you joy, and I pray you know, truly know, that you changed a life. Henley read the letter to Catherine, his voice broke. She wiped tears from her own eyes and said, You should go, visit them. Never did. Perhaps because the memory was too precious to risk disappointing with reality, or perhaps because he feared confronting how much time had passed, how much had changed. Instead, he wrote back a careful letter telling Elsa about his family, his teaching, his quiet life in Kent. He sent a photograph of Elizabeth and his son James, now 6, and he thanked her for remembering, for carrying forward the small seed of kindness he'd planted in the worst of times. They exchanged letters occasionally over the years, Christmas cards with photographs, brief updates about children growing, careers changing, grandchildren arriving. The correspondence was sparse but steady, a thread connecting 2 lives that had intersected for mere weeks, but had been permanently altered by that intersection. In 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, Henley watched the footage with tears streaming down his face, thinking of Elsa and Klaus and their children, thinking of a divided country finally healing, thinking of how long the shadows of war could stretch. Elsa's final letter arrived in 1993. Klaus had died of a heart attack, sudden and unexpected. She was now a grandmother, living with her daughter Anna's family. Her handwriting had grown shaky, but the warmth remained. I am old now, Thomas, she wrote, and my memories grow fuzzy, but I will never forget your face through the wire, the way you looked at us and saw people, not enemies. That memory is sharp as glass. When my time comes, I will carry it with me, grateful to the end. Henley folded that letter carefully and placed it in a box with all the others, along with the first letter from 1945, the photograph she'd sent of her wedding, the Christmas card with her grandchildren's names. The box sat in his study, a quiet archive of a life saved and a connection maintained across borders and decades. When Henley died in 1998, at the age of 78, his children found the box while sorting his effects. They read the letters with astonishment, never having heard the full story of what their father had done in the war. Margaret attended the funeral and told them everything, filling in the gaps their father's modesty had left. Your father, she said, was the best kind of hero, the kind who never thought of himself that way. They contacted Elsa, now elderly and frail in Lübeck. She couldn't travel to the funeral. but she sent flowers with a card that read simply, "For Thomas, who gave me my life. Rest in peace, dear friend." Anna, Elsa's daughter, travelled to England on her mother's behalf and stood quietly at the graveside, a German woman honouring a British soldier, connected by a kindness shown 53 years before to a starving girl in the mud. At the reception afterward, Anna told Henley's children about her mother's stories, about how Elsa had built her entire moral framework around the lesson learned in that camp, that one person's choice could ripple outward in ways impossible to measure. "My mother," Anna said, "taught me to always see the person, not the category. She learned that from your father. And I've taught it to my children, and they will teach their children. What he didn't end with my mother's survival. It continues." Elizabeth, Henley's daughter, now a teacher herself, understood then the full weight of her father's silence. He hadn't spoken of it because the act itself was never about recognition or praise. It was simply what his conscience had demanded in a moment when the world had offered him a choice, and in making that choice, he had set in motion ripples that reached across generations, touching lives he would never meet, shaping a future he would never see. Elsa died 2 years later, in the year 2000, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. Among her possessions, they found the letters from Henley, carefully preserved, annotated in the margins with her own thoughts and memories. Will requested that the letters be donated to the Imperial War Museum in London as testimony to the small mercies that helped heal a broken continent. They rest there now, in climate-controlled archives, available to researchers studying not just the machinery of war, but its human aftermath, the moments when people chose connection over cruelty, when exhausted soldiers extended hands instead of turning away. The camp where they met is now a housing development, modest homes with gardens where barbed wire once stood. No plaque marks what happened there, no monument records the names, but the land remembers in its own way, in the ordinary lives built atop extraordinary suffering, in the children who play where children once starved, in the persistence of normalcy after catastrophe. History books mention the broad strokes, the millions of prisoners, the displaced persons, the massive humanitarian crisis of post-war Europe. They rarely mention the individual soldiers who made different choices, who saw categories as people, who risked reprimand to offer biscuits and water. But those moments, accumulated across a continent, were how healing began. Not through grand gestures or sweeping policies, but through 1,000 small refusals to let compassion die along with everything else. Thomas Henley's grave in Kent bears a simple inscription: teacher, soldier, father. He chose kindness. Visitors sometimes leave flowers, usually descendants of Elsa's family, making pilgrimages to honour the man who saved their grandmother, their great-grandmother, the woman whose survival allowed them to exist. They come from Germany, from England, from places neither Henley nor Elsa ever imagined their families might spread, and they come because stories like this, stories of small mercies in merciless times, remind us that history is not just the march of armies and the clash of ideologies, but the accumulation of individual choices, each one mattering, each one rippling outward into futures we cannot foresee. But he knew, even as he said it, that forgetting was impossible. This, all of this, would stay with him. "Will you be all right?" he asked. Elsa considered. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Germany is broken. My family, I don't know if they live. But I will try. That is all I can promise." They sat together as the light faded, not speaking, simply sharing the strange peace of two people who had met in the worst of times and found in each other a reminder of better ones. When full darkness came, Elsa stood. "I should go," she said. Henley rose as well. "Take care of yourself, Elsa." "You too, Thomas," she replied, using his first name for the first time. Then, impulsively, she reached through the wire and briefly clasped his hand. The touch was fleeting, but it carried the weight of everything unspoken between them. The trucks came at dawn. The women climbed aboard, their faces composed but eyes red-rimmed. Henley stood at attention as they departed, watching until the convoy disappeared into the distance. The rain still falls on the fields of northern Germany, washing the land clean season after season. The scars of war have faded, though not disappeared. And in the spaces between remembering and forgetting, between the official histories and the quiet testimonies, the echo of a corporal's defiance persists. I won't let you die here. Not a grand pronouncement, not a speech for the history books, just a promise made by one exhausted soldier to a group of starving women, a promise kept through biscuits and blankets and bureaucratic battles, a promise whose ripples continue to spread, touching lives decades later, reminding us that in the ruins of everything, the choice to be human matters most of all. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.